evening. I'm Lydia Kegler. I'm the director of the Bloomsburg Public Library, and I thank you all for coming out tonight. We have a great program. Professor Safa Sadachoglu from the university. He is an associate professor at BU, and his specialty is Islamic history, the Ottoman Empire, and issues of the Middle East. And after a brief presentation of about 15-20 minutes, we'll have a casual Q&A. You get to hear and answer questions. And please, feel free to participate in the evening this evening and anytime. Just to let you know, we are filming this event and hope to at some time have a link for this so that we can put this on our website as well, so that if there are colleagues, friends that were not here this evening, that we might have access to that. We'll let you know how that develops. And thank you very much. And Safa, please.
Thank you very much. So, I'll try to keep this into 15 minutes, and that's why I printed it out. I'm trying to avoid reading it, but I don't want to go beyond that. Much of this hopefully will build on questions and answers. And I'll try to limit pretty much everything that I'm going to say into 3 different problems. I wrote them down so that I don't get lost, and I keep them up here so that I can refer back to them. A lot of what I say here, obviously I'm not going to drop a lot of names or cite sources, but I have a long list of examples, and I'll be happy to share those with anybody who is interested. All you need to do is email me, and I can send the long list of websites that I gathered information from. Okay. Essentially, my focus today, I want to focus on 3 problems that determine that shape the way that we see the current mess that we have in that region. I see these 3 problems as a barrier in front of our understanding of what's going on in the region. So the first issue that I see is misunderstanding why refugees suffer. The second one is a historical and simplistic view of the Middle East. The third issue is refusing to see who benefits from polarization and terror. I will explain all these 3 issues in detail in a second, but I want to make one thing clear. I don't think these issues exist on their own. They are a result of questions that pop in our minds. So the way I want to proceed today is just first give examples of the questions that lead us to the first issue in our thinking pattern about the problems that we see here. For example, if we take the misunderstanding of why refugees suffer, some of the questions that relate to this pattern of thinking is, why are there so many refugees, and why do they suffer so much? So that encourages us to think about the problem that we see often most common today, and in the particular processes of our thinking, I think, is shaped with a specific misunderstanding, and that's what I want to elaborate on. That's what I want to talk a bit briefly on, and then I would love to answer your questions regarding that. And then afterwards, I'll do the same with the others too. So, having said that, I think these misunderstandings, the simplistic views or refusal to see what is apparent, is putting us in a position where we feel like we have to choose between 2 irrelevant options. That we have to choose, for example, if you are hungry, you feel like you have to choose between reading a book or going for a walk. Neither of those are options to your solutions to your problem. But when you feel like those are your only 2 options, then you end up feel like you're stuck and you're powerless. And oftentimes, because of these barriers, we end up finding ourselves powerless in issues relating to Middle East and in particular to the refugee problem. So the first problem, misunderstanding of why refugees suffer. Again, the questions that might trigger this kind of false thinking is, why are there so many refugees? Why do they suffer so much? Or a bunch of other related questions that might lead us to misunderstand the way that refugees are suffering. We see them suffer on the news, in the newspapers, everywhere. We see them suffer. And we feel like we have to do something in that situation. Either host a refugee or do help an organization that helps with the refugees, etc. But on the other hand, there's this drive. There's that irk that says, can they be dangerous? Is there something we're risking by helping them, by housing them, by letting them into the country? So there's the false dichotomy, there's the duality that we see. Should we help? Should we use our humanity? Or should we actually protect what is our own? And this duality, this choice, is a false choice. I don't think we have to choose between those two, because we misunderstand why they are suffering. We think they are suffering because the country, Syria, is under war, they're leaving the country. Yes, that is correct. They are suffering primarily because the country is being bombarded by pretty much most of the world today. When was the last time that we saw U.S. and Iran actually bombing a country together? But their suffering does not have to do with these events or this violence as much as we think. The bombings and the violence is pushing them out. The suffering starts at that point, but becomes more intense after that. They suffer because they have to drown in the Mediterranean Sea as opposed to flying over the Mediterranean Sea, for example. They suffer because they have to be pulled in these concentration camps in Greece, in Slovakia, in other places where they have to suffer months on end instead of just actually being able to go into Europe, into places where they want to live or places where they are accepted, they're welcome, for example, Sweden, Norway, other countries. They suffer because of these issues. And these issues are not necessarily directly related to violence in Syria. Let's take the first example of drowning in the Mediterranean. Why do these people drown? Why do they have to go by sea? Why can't they just fetch an airplane? Taking a boat will cost you about $1,000 across the Mediterranean, and it's very expensive and it's very risky because you travel in very risky conditions. A lot of people drown in the process. Whereas if you take an airplane, you can just go straight in and for a much lesser price, about $500, you can find a flight from anywhere in that region all the way into Sweden, Norway, or wherever you want to go. Why the boats? Why the sea? Because European Union regulations require that, necessitate that airline companies do not take any passengers without proper paperwork. Which means, or if they take, they have to return them back to Europe, back to where they come from. So if you take a refugee from Syria, and if that person does not have proper paperwork, I'll get back to that in a second, then the airline company will have to take them back. And we know that airline companies are not very keen on wasting money. So they're not going to do that. So why do these people do not get their refugee papers before they actually go in there? They can't because European regulations require that you apply for a refugee status in Europe. So you have to actually land into Europe, step in there, and you can't do it by air, only by boat. And once you are in there, you can apply for a refugee status. And there's another regulation, for example, a Dublin regulation in the European Union, that requires that refugees are, their applications are taken at their first instance of being registered. So when you're coming in, say if you're coming in from Greece, you have to register with EU there at that point, saying that I want to become a refugee. So all these seemingly irrelevant regulations, rules, create this situation for these refugees. They can't take the airplane because airplane companies will not take them. So they have to take the boat. If they make it to the other way, they can't go straight into where they want to be. Say, for example, if you have relatives, friends, family in Sweden who's saying, come over here, I'll host you, we have a structure. You can't go straight to Sweden. You first have to wait to be registered in Greece, in Bulgaria, in Slovakia, or another one of those bordering poor nations in Europe, relatively poor nations in Europe. Without doing that registration process, you cannot move further in Europe unless you choose to go illegally. That is on foot, crossing the borders illegally, jumping over barbed wire, and all that sort of stuff. The stuff that we see as they are suffering. That is created as a result of this mechanical, bureaucratic, legal process. They are suffering, yes, because there's warfare in Syria. But we're making this worse by actually putting these barriers in front of them, making sure that they travel illegally throughout the borders, or they are smuggled into Europe in boats or in truckloads. That's the first misunderstanding. That's the first issue. That's the first problematic that we have. And because of the way that we don't see this, we tend to look at their suffering as if, okay, are we going to protect them? Are we going to be human towards the refugees? Or are we going to actually be afraid of them? As opposed to saying, why can't we do something legal? Why can't we change something? Why can't we have, for example, a temporary visa status for these refugees that they can apply to back in Syria, or maybe in places like Turkey or Egypt, where they go out in the first instance, and then have them incorporated and then deal with a lot of other stuff. Allow them to fly in under humanitarian visa regulations. Trudeau yesterday just welcomed about thousands of Syrian refugees, and he said, he was very open about it. Today they're coming in as refugees, but past beyond this gate point, they will become permanent residents. This is not impossible. There are examples of this being done, and this is being done today. And we're not locked with this dilemma of choosing between our humanity and our fear of strangers, our fear of terrorists. Okay. So that's the first thought pattern that I think is wrong. The second, and probably more problematic for me to talk because I teach about it, so I try to keep it as brief and as short as possible. The issues about our misunderstandings about the Middle East. We look at Middle East from an ahistorical perspective, from a perspective that defies history, pretends as if history didn't exist, didn't matter at all, or we look at it as a very simplistic matter. There are two periods that I want to focus on, 1950s, 60s, bringing up to the 21st century, and in particular 21st century. We have been involved in this region for a long while, but we end up asking questions such as, why is there so much violence in this region? Or why is there a war in Syria and Iraq? Those things seem like creation of 21st century, that's something that's happening recently. Whereas what I would argue, and what many of the historians argue, point out, that these wars, these violences have their roots back in 1950s and 60s. And we have been involved with it. Now, our involvement with this creates a structure that we tend to think, they're suffering because we messed up their politics, we occupied them or we changed their politics, or alternatively, there's so much violence in that region because they're backward. They don't know how to be civilized. So we're thrown in between, either are we going to stand on behalf of them and defend their rights, how we messed up their politics, or on the other hand, are we going to say they're backward, they're primitive people, they don't know what civilization is. Again, I don't think this is a duality that needs to exist. I think this is a false duality. I think there's a more nuanced way of understanding our involvement and the rest of the world's involvement in that region. We have been dealing with the Middle East since 1950s on, as I said, much earlier than that, but let's focus on 1950s for time being. We took part in the revolutions in Iraq and in Syria that put the current, the dictatorial governments in place. Saddam Hussein, which we toppled later on, was brought into place thanks to our help and our support. We supported him militarily, financially, economically, and also we even engaged in battles with Iran on his behalf. We attacked Iran on behalf of Iraq throughout the 1980s. In Syria, we tried to organize a coup d'etat with the help of CIA. We messed it up. Then Russians, USSR at that point, stepped in, and actually Syria merged towards Russia. And as a result, what happened is that we had these sort of, in the midst of Cold War, we lost Syria, but we worked against Syria. We kept it under control. We sort of said that you're a torturer, you're a terrorist, you're supporting international terrorism, and etc. But we didn't do anything about it because we're in the midst of Cold War. So at the end, we ended up with dealing with these two sort of nations, shaping their history, bringing people into power, supporting people, or because of unintended consequences, generating outcomes that led to coming of power of the current dictators, or the past dictator in the case of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, or the Assad regime. Both of those groups came to power with our involvement. But this doesn't tell all the story. Our economic involvement in the region was limited throughout 1980s. When we come to the 21st century, our direct foreign investment in these countries increases from almost zero, the levels of zero, to $200 billion in the case of Syria and $300 billion in the case of Iraq. And that money is coming not just from us, but also a whole bunch of foreign countries, including the European Union and others. And the countries themselves might have a singular stance saying that we don't support you, we don't support your dictatorial regime, but in the background, individual companies, private individuals, negotiated business deals both with Syria and Iraq. As a result of that, we came to a position in the 21st century, we created this mess, but we have also invested in this mess, the violent dictatorial regimes in the Middle East. Soon after we took over in 2003, U.S. invasion of Iraq, the American investment in that region increased tremendously. The U.S. contractors' deals in the first decade of Iraqi invasion was about $138 billion. When we invaded Iraq, we said these people, this country, this government does not have money to pay for their own individuals. But actually, they had some money and we exploited that money. And our tax dollars also went to these sort of negotiations of $138 billion. So we have been making business with these groups. And just like we've been making business with certain individuals from those countries. With Saddam Hussein's government, we made business. With those who opposed the Assad regime, we made business. So we are not necessarily dealing them as we are either for you or against you basis. There's a much complicated relationship here that involves individual contractors. Kellogg's is one of the major contractors that actually deals with Iraqi U.S. bases in Iraq and the rest of the region. They make billions of dollars out of their contracts in that region. Halliburton was another company that Dick Cheney served at the board of advisors for a while. So all these companies have been involved in this region through us, with us, against us at times. So that's the other element that we need to keep in mind. So there is no singular involvement with these countries. We don't actually support or criticize or attack them. We have a relationship with them, a complicated relationship. That on the forefront, in the diplomatics, in the politics, we might be saying you're bad, we don't support you, or we support you, we like what you're doing. But in the background, individuals and companies make business with different groups in these countries. Take the example of the Ba'athification process. After U.S. invasion, we followed the leadership of a man named Ahmed Chalabi, who was involved in the University of Chicago. He was being, at that point, they were searching him, or they was being sought after because of financial irregularities that has to do with Lebanon. But we believed in his word, and we made him the leader of what we call the Ba'athification process. Saddam Hussein in Iraq, when he came to power, he established a political party structure called Ba'ath. And members of Ba'ath were everywhere, from teachers to bank employees to policemen and vice versa, and etc. When we got in there, Ahmed Chalabi had us believe that we have to get rid of all of these people. We have to get rid of anybody and everybody that was involved with the Iraqi regime, previous Iraqi regime. And when we did that, we created a large bunch of enemies, which recently a Washington Post reporter revealed that ended up joining ISIS, Daesh, the Islamic terrorist organization that we're trying to understand today. Why? Because we wanted to follow the lead of Ahmed Chalabi. Ahmed Chalabi, who recently died, had a major impact and also had a lot of cronies around himself too. He was protecting his own interests and those who were loyal to him. So this is not a one-on-one relationship between two governments, but more a relationship between those who support Ahmed Chalabi in Iraq and in this country versus those who were against Ahmed Chalabi in Iraq and in this country. So this is not an us versus them discussion. This is a much more complicated discussion. If you want to understand this, we need to avoid this simplistic perspective and focus on where the money flows, who benefits from this, who benefits from this violence. And we need to bear in mind that our involvement, our historical involvement, actually obliges us to do that, because we are historically responsible from that violence. We created that. And when I say we, I'm not talking about this country only, but also European Union, but also USSR back then, but also any kind of first world or second world countries that contributed to the violence in that region. So there's that historical perspective and that nuanced understanding of the politics and economics in that region. So that's the second wrong thought process that I wanted to discuss. The third one, they're refusing to see who benefits from polarization and terror. This problem comes up, or this wrong way of thinking comes up as we are trying to answer questions such as, what triggers acts of terrorism? Why do they hate us? Why do they attack us? Who gets hurt by them? Or who benefits from them? These questions ask us to find responsible people and to look for answers in violent acts. And oftentimes, with the lack of information or our denial of seeing that information, we're pushed to a corner where we see ISIS as this violent and irrational group that are just killing people at random. They are maniacs. They're just attacking. And there's us. We have to do something to defeat that. But we don't know where they are. We don't know who they are. We don't know where they're hiding. We don't know when the next action will come. So we can't do anything. The only thing we can do, oftentimes this kind of thinking leads to, is to ban out all the Muslims or to scrutinize them heavily until we figure out what is wrong with them, or until we figure out if they are associated with the wrong parties. And we're not good at that. As we know from the recent California killing, the woman that we've been focusing on as the radicalizer, I don't know why she's the radicalizer, because she's from outside probably. The woman that we've been focusing on as the radicalizer had postings on her social media site saying that he sympathizes with radical Islamic views. We approved her visa. We didn't notice that. We didn't check, do background process check. So we are put in a position as if we need to catch what is not catchable. What is missing from this picture is actually right in front of our eyes. Who's benefiting from this? Who's benefiting from this fruitless, meaningless hunt? ISIS is benefiting from this. And this is not me saying that. ISIS have been very open about this. In 2004, on the web, there was a PDF book, which is easily available, was published in Arabic. The book on management of savagery, it's called, which is the last step before establishing an Islamic empire, according to ISIS. And they've been following this book. The book was translated in 2006 into English by a group involved in Harvard University, and it's available, as I said. And I have the references here if you're interested. In that book, if you follow the book, you can see the motivations and the plans behind ISIS's or Daesh's activities. One of the key things that they focus on is polarization of society. They want to divide Muslims with everyone else. They want to divide the Muslims in the Middle East. They say, if you are loyal to us, are you a true Muslim or are you against us? They want to isolate the Muslims in Europe and the United States. They call it explicitly polarization. They want to, and they're very clear about that, they want to achieve this through violence. They want us to hate Muslims. And they hope that this will create the outflow of Muslims from Europe and the United States to Syria, which Al Jazeera recently reported. Those who fight foreign fighters among ISIS increased tremendously in the past year, since we started engaging with ISIS since 2011, but more so in the past year. So this is something that they want, and they're very clear about that. They're not hiding that. If you follow their online magazines, they publish a magazine called Dabiq, D-A-B-I-Q. In that, they emphasize that Muslims should leave places where they don't feel free, and they should come to the world of Islamic State, the Daesh. They should come to the caliphate that they create. And they said that much earlier, actually, around 2012 or 2013, if I'm not mistaken. It was in the 4th issue of their magazine. And they've been very clear about that. In their social media platforms, in their clips that they create, they invite Americans, Europeans to come and fight with them there. They invite Muslims living in those places to come fight on their behalf there as well. And by hating Muslims, by burning their mosques, as we've been seeing lately, or by stopping them, interrogating them. Several people have been pushed out of airplanes, not pushed, but not allowed to travel in the airplanes because they either pray in public in Arabic or they essentially look threatening. They've been just please step aside, and they miss their flight, they get humiliated and all that. By doing all this sort of stuff, we are creating this xenophobia, we're playing into what ISIS wants. So we are making them benefit from that. Second, who benefits from that? It doesn't end there. The armament industry. Since we have actually increased our involvement in that region, it is well-known fact, and they're very open, and there are several reports cited here, that weapons industry made increased amounts of wealth, generated increased amounts of wealth because of our involvement in that region. We either sell drones or clever bombs to countries like Syria or Iraq or Saudi Arabia or other places that actually use those things to kill their own people. Or we actually benefit from other countries scared from the current violence in those regions. If you've Intercept recently published some stuff about how Locksmith Martin, the CEOs, were actually talking about how this is benefiting them, this increased level of violence. About a couple of months ago, again, the CEO of Locksmith Martin was actually on a stock owners debriefing, was saying that she was not alarmed by the rapprochement, the improvement of relationships between the U.S. and Iran, because she said, we always see this region as a problematic region. We have a lot of business there. We look forward to increased business there in that region. I'm not saying that they are creating the violence, but we are not seeing that they are benefiting from the presence of that violence in there. And particularly if you're talking about measures to help the refugees, for example, to help the refugee camps and etc., if we're talking about ways to help or eliminate the violence, I think those who benefit from that can pay some of the burden. Or at least we can talk about that. We can discuss that. We can make it an issue of politics. But we don't, because we don't focus on that. Because that knowledge is not visible, is not available to us. So refusing to see what is apparently visible to us. Those are the two sort of things that I want to focus on that thing. That we are asked to think like we're dealing with an irrational, violent enemy. And nobody's benefiting from that. It is not. They're open about what they want. They have been open about what they want. And our ignorance is benefiting them and benefiting others who are not here. So those are the three different thought processes, wrong thought processes, that I think that shape the way that we approach to this issue. I think by circumventing these, we can become more apt at identifying who's liable from this process. What can we do about this? Instead of giving into xenophobic demands, instead of giving into silence, instead of giving into turning the other way to see others benefit from this violence, we can actually ask relevant questions if we avoid these patterns. Thank you for your time. I want to leave the rest of the time to answer questions that you might have.
We always hear in the news about the Shiites and the Sunnis, but I noticed you didn't mention that, and that some people say that they were really involved in an 8th century warfare, and that really, those are the true causes.
They are not. I mean, I have some students here who know that they are not. I always rant about that. It's not. It's not. There are issues and there are events in the 8th century that separated Sunni Muslims from Shia Muslims. Those events have not been articulated until 10th century by certain groups to establish Shiism. What we know as Shiism is established in the 10th century. It's not in the 8th century. And since then, they've been fighting on and off on different issues intermittently, but they are not fighting continuously from that period on, not because of religious issues. They're fighting because of political issues. Today, there is a disagreement between Shia forces and the Sunni forces in that region. And Shia forces are represented by Iran, Hezbollah, and some parts of Iraq, and they are often in minority in places like Yemen or Bahrain or other countries. And Sunni forces are represented by Iraq, Syria, sometimes there's Libya and other important countries, Jordan or Egypt in that region. It's very difficult to draw a line between Sunni and Shia. In fact, it was much more intermixed. And we know that for a fact. If BBC did a study of, I think it was promoted a study of neighborhood patterns in Baghdad before and after U.S. invasion. Before the U.S. invasion, you have this very intertwined neighborhood patterns. And after U.S. invasion, you can see that Shias move to one corner, Sunni moves to one corner. So then sectarian violence begins. Today we have Sunni Shia sectarian violence because people can, and they know that they can, achieve something by declaring allegiance to one group or another. If you declare yourself as a Shia group, then you can just get support from Hezbollah or Iran, or the corollary of that. If you attack the Shia forces, you can justify, oh, I've been attacking only the Shia forces. Whereas we know that there's plundering, there's killing, unaccounted killings in Iraq and in Syria, which are often justified as we were attacking the Sunni forces or we were attacking the Shia forces. So the whole Sunni-Shia divide is being used, being simplified. That has to do with the second one. Being simplified, boiled down to an 8th century event that has absolutely no relevance to what's going on today. And because of that, we think that these people have been hating each other since 8th century, 9th century. It's not. We are, and this is not a current process. This happened in the 19th century, and then in Lebanon, and then later on in the 20th century, the entire region. These things happen because we give people the power to use religion to kill others, or to make money out of it.
Everybody here, I'm sure, is aware of 30 seconds. Probably most of the people in this particular group are rather horrified by that particular column. My question is, this is a tiny group, and we know what Columbia County is. How do we find some way to make this available? Cui bono. How do we get cui bono to the bulk of the population, to the people who are attacking women who wear headscarves, which is now why I will be wearing a headscarf in public outside, because I don't have to. Do you have any? Does anybody have any?
Press Enterprise has been very kind, and they got in touch with me, and they will be promoting this event, talking about this event. And as I said, I will be very happy to share whatever I have to everybody. I try to keep it brief, thinking that people might be interested in the sources that I use, and I'll be sharing this with them as well. And beyond that, I talk about these issues a lot in my classes, and we'll do some more information sessions at the university, hopefully next semester. I've been trying to do some events, not necessarily focusing on that.
Is there anything available for the public schools that won't get teachers killed for using?
Well, as I said, this, in terms of intellectual property, this is my intellectual property, and I have no qualms about it. I'll be happy to share it with anybody. As I said, all I need is just, if I have your email, I'll be happy to send it to you. If you want to send, that's fine with me. This is not, again, this is just a brief summary, a framework, and with a lot of references to newspaper articles, some databases, and there are a couple scholarly articles. I try to stay away from the scholarly articles, but try to use blog entries and newspaper sites that are reliable, reputable, in framing this. So I'll be happy to share that, and I think that should be very easily accessible to anybody who wants to read more, understand more about this process. I just want to make that clear.
Wants to.
Who wants to? I cannot make people want to.
That's my concern. How do we, no, seriously, to everybody here,
People will
how
want
do we
to.
make this palatable? How do we make this engaging
People
in
will
Columbia
want
County?
to.
How do we do that?
People will want to do that because these events will not end. As I said, these are coming
Socratic method.
from a code book, from a book of methods. And they will do more of this. And we're going to see more of this. And the more we see of this, the more people will want to understand because it's a survival issue.
As a retired psychologist working in the LGBT community, I don't think the 32nd crowd would be moved by facts, data, and the very thing I think that we moved by, sadly, is what's going on in the polarization, especially on the far right. I'm a Paul McCruger, the economist. Anyway, he says, Krugman, yes, but most people doubt this, even liberals. They say we have the most radical Republican Party we've ever had for 200 years, let alone Columbia County, which anybody historian would show you that they almost went for the South. They're very, very conservative, very, very, what do you want to call it? So we have a local issue here. But these prejudices are now being, you can turn on your TV and watch Donald Trump at work. We can laugh at it. We're not trying to say that that's not too far from what, if you read the 30 seconds with a little bit of objectivity and a little bit of interest as an academic, you're going to see the same forces, comments, pushing, directing, with black and white thinking, kind of, and towards violence. And this is disturbing to me.
Yeah. To me, that's one.
That's exactly my concern, yeah.
To me, that's one. It's totally
I have a question, like in the Bataclan, I mean, there was indiscriminate killing of Muslim victims. And I just wondered if that was in the playbook or the rule book, because that in the Muslim community could have some repercussion against them.
Yes, and the Bataclan killings, in Paris, and there were a lot of Muslims. So were there a lot of Muslims in pretty much everywhere, in Turkey and Egypt and in Iraq, where there were several events in Lebanon, just right before that, the day before, and Turkey, a week before that, about the same number of people died. And so, in all these things, there are Muslim casualties, but those Muslims are in the wrong place in the wrong time. They should come to that's the perspective of that's what they're trying to promote, saying that you are in the wrong place. So their death, I'm not saying that, I'm not saying, but their death serves as a warning and a purpose, saying that you shouldn't be there in the first place, because you're in a place, and again, this is a very specific theological construct that they're using. Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, moves from one city to another in his lifespan. And the way that he justifies that move is essentially saying that I was in a place where I was not welcome. I chose to go to a place where I am welcome. That's called hijrah in Islam, hagira, hijrah. And that is that came to be a very significant event. And that choice of leaving where you're not welcome and going to a place where you're welcome dictated Muslim choices later in the 15th century, for example, when Muslims were being pushed out of or forced to convert in Spain, or after that, under colonial regime, what do we do with that? So this is a very specific theological construct that they're relying on. And in that construct, if you're in the wrong place, that's your problem. I mean, you should have followed Muhammad's example. So being a Muslim doesn't absolve you from anything. And obviously it does not win them any good points.
Yeah.
Their fatwas against ISIS at this point, their religious opinions against ISIS. Egypt has been very strong in condemning ISIS and saying that those people need to be punished. And according to Sharia, according to Islamic law, murder has one kind of punishment. There are different ways you approach that punishment, but that's essentially that involves an eye for an eye kind of a punishment. It's a capital punishment. So those people are already condemned to death by other Muslims. ISIS is condemned to death for not being a Muslim. So, but it doesn't change the fact that they actually. Yes.
You mentioned the 50s and the 60s, and I noticed as a general tendency with Afghanistan and Iran in the 70s, that was a real major point of surgence with fundamentalism usurping, or that's a common term, displacing Arabian nationalism or Afghani nationalism. What really served as a root function for that?
What served as a root function for?
What was the catalyst? What made it shift from nationalism to fundamentalism being the dominant ideology?
Fundamentalism played, or what is the larger umbrella of those movements called Salafism, S-A-L-A-F-I-S-M. Salafism is a sort of reformist religious movement that primarily North African countries first, but then later on other Afghanistan and Pakistan, use in a way to rebuke foreign powers. They wanted to become independent, right? You know, their Boston Tea Party, so to say, was essentially tinted or framed around their religious ideals. They said, we strayed from our true path, and we have to now go back to our true path. Now, this was one of the groups, and we see this most clearly in Iran. Religious groups were just one of the groups. In the Iranian Revolution in 1979, for example, the Iranian Communist Party was very powerful, very influential. But somehow, because of international politics and diplomacy, because of our fear against communism, our fear of communism, we ended up supporting, promoting more and more the groups that we thought had nothing to do with communism. And there are scholars, including Bernard Lewis and others, who argue that Islam is not compatible, or Islam actually just, you know, is not very compatible, cannot deal with communism as good, so we might want to support Muslims. They changed their perspectives. They said, oh, Islam is actually, will be okay with dictatorial regimes, so we must be very careful. So it's a lot of international support, and much of the stuff that we do not know or we cannot know. But those groups were brought to power or gained power through their networks, through the legitimacy that they gained from others because they fought for their country's independence, and through international networks.
Now, couldn't the argument that they are completely incompatible with communism also apply equally towards any of the Abrahamic faiths?
Yes.
So,
Why do we not see this in other Abrahamic
it just seems like a, what would I say? It should have been a more obvious connection. I mean, how the Soviet Union had itself come into severe conflict with the Orthodox Church within Russia.
Yeah, again, in the case of, if you take the case of Syria and Iraq, despite the, I don't think their religious affiliation had anything to do with the U.S. foreign policy. That was what was being circulated at the time. But much of the politics in those regions, much of our support for the Ba'ath regimes there, or for other sort of dictatorial secular regimes there, have been shaped by our Cold War policies. Soviets back then, Russians, were supporting certain countries. And certain countries were on the brink, the third world countries, so-called, the independent ones. Egypt was at the brink, they couldn't decide what to do. And they were getting help from both sides, or whatever side that they can get help from. But it is that dynamics, that international dynamics, that complexity of that dynamics, that we need to understand if we want to see why these dictatorial governments flourished. They're flourishing, that is, if you have a secular dictatorial regime that oppresses religious groups, will eventually provide more legitimacy for these offshoot groups. They couldn't kill them because they don't have enough infrastructure in those countries. They don't have the financial infrastructure to actually do mass surveillance like we do in this country. And we can avoid violence. We can avoid fringe groups. They can't. So, yeah.
I noticed you used the word concentration camp. I didn't know if that's what you intended to say, or were you referring to refugee camps?
Refugee camps. Refugee camps,
Okay,
but they are unfortunately operating very much like at this point in horrible conditions, like the internment camps that we have in this country. And we are essentially creating a very impossible situation for those refugees. Just recently, about either last week or a couple of weeks ago, someone in Calais, in France, in a refugee camp, jumped into one of these trucks while moving so that he can just jump in and go across without being caught. So, you know, they're jumping to their death, and the police did not even stop the driver, apparently. Their death loses its meaning. And I didn't mean to imply that they're being coagulated or collected there deliberately, or just being tormented for just being a refugee, but we have absolutely very little respect for the people who are living there.
You were asking about things to do, and one of the things obviously is education, encouraging schools to have guest speakers like Safa come. But the other thing would be also possibly to take maybe a bit of a, there are some people you're never going to convince to not hate maybe, but you can make it socially unacceptable by increasing awareness of what it means to be Muslim, and so like, you know, maybe taking like an interfaith approach, talking to ministers and rabbis and imams if we have any. I mean, I honestly don't know, I'm not religious, but you know, there was just a story the other day that in Omaha, Nebraska, they're building a synagogue, a mosque, and a church to share a parking lot, and trying to, they've been working on this for years now. So you might want to think about trying to talk to religious leaders in the region to come up with some ways of creating greater acceptance through awareness and emphasizing messages of love.
Yeah, and informing people essentially about the practices of Islam.
Just a slight challenge to that, because I spent about 2 years or more on the LGBTQ. I thought that would expand here, and we would go. The last 2 years, we were kind of like a wash in one respect. But I was considered a religious humanist. I now realize that most of the religions will not give up their God. They will give up kindness, and then they'll get that part of it right. Basically, they're not as good as I see it as the Eleanor Roosevelt. She had the human rights in the 1948. I'm trying to say that may be a prior work. This is why ACLU might have a prior claim to it. Because this is a human rights issue, as I see. And so if you can protect the rights of gays, so on, which you can't seem to do here in Bloomsburg, and we're on the cusp of it, why not add Muslims to it? But I'm very cautious of adding religion, because if you look at it carefully, the religious do not support if it's against their creed, if it's not central to their creed. Whereas with the other humanists, where if you're an unbeliever, actually have a better shot in terms of making separation church and state. So while you're bringing in the so on, I would say a lot better tactic was let's think of everybody who are being victimized and who we pick on and who religious creeds say, and then clean up the whole mess, clean up the religious creeds if they want to. But I think you have a better shot with the unbelievers in terms of law, in terms of separation of church and state. That's just my opinion here, working in Bloomsburg and being a little bit disappointed. I've changed in about a year to this point.
I mean, two things. I don't necessarily see religion as capable of doing something. Religions do not have arms, legs. Religions don't kill. That's just the way that people use religions, and there are. And in France, there was an LGBT Muslim community, for example. They were organizing around a mosque. And in this country, there's a gay imam who's been actually touring. It was a couple of years ago. I was being broadcasted on Al Jazeera, and touring around the country, and in one of those places they actually met that gay imam. A few years back, there was a book that came out as The Bread of Bilal, or Bilal's Bread, which talked about the coming out story of an American Muslim. So I don't necessarily see as religion being against any particular kind of gender or sexual orientation. But there are people who are correct. There are people who actually focus on framing it in that way. I agree, perhaps framing this in the universal human rights element might be a good way to go. But then I think Lisa's point is that there is something very urgent here, that we are actually seeing mosques being attacked with firebombs, not firebombs, but with being attacked with certain explosive devices, and they one of those places they wrote, Muslims, I hope you die a painful death. In another place they wrote, it was something like Jesus is the Savior or Jesus is Lord or some kind of message. I don't know where these attacks are coming from. There's no reason for me to assume that they're coming from Christian communities. For all I know, ISIS might be doing that as well, because that's working with what they're trying to achieve. But regardless, it doesn't change the fact that there's an urgent thing here. And there's a French guy, I forgot his name, I mentioned that came out after the shootings in Bataclan, and made a YouTube video that a lot of people actually must have seen. He said he refuses to hate Muslims. Just blanking out on his name. Antoine Léry. Yeah, Antoine Léry. And he did a very impressive short YouTube clip where he said, I deny to give you my hate. I think, if we can push that point, and I'm not the person to tell people what to do, but if we can promote more peaceful acceptance rather than hatred, particularly for the Muslim communities, I think that might answer some of the urgent points.
Well, I was wondering about your thoughts about a middle road. Seems like a lot of people will be polarized by this very issue in terms of the refugee crisis. There will be people hating Muslims and people hating. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And that just increases polarization. So if you have any thoughts about, rather than the either or that you were talking about, you either understand it as this or that, the middle road between keep them out, let them in.
I think one of the things that could be done is actually to watch for what kind of solutions are being done by European governments, or what kind of calls are being done. There's a current call for humanitarian visas and application for the EU and larger countries. But we need to make these issues problematic so that the policymakers can vote on these issues. If Canadian government is actually accepting and giving permanent residence to that many people, that many thousands of people in one day, and if those are, we won't get to that point unless we debate why and how we can get there. And how do we debate this? I mean, obviously, letting the refugees, there is another organization here, refugeesettlementwatch.com or something like that, which is an anti-refugee settlement organization that tries to increase xenophobia across the nation and says, okay, we shouldn't be supporting refugees. There are, very organized groups that promote that. But despite all that, there are refugees that are being settled in Allentown, in the Pennsylvania area. So, you can choose to help them, that's one thing, or you can actually choose to put pressure on your policymakers saying that we should, this is our right. I mean, because we vote for these people, so this is our right to demand that from them. And refuse to accept these are a threat. This is not the issue, this is not the dilemma that we need to face. The issue there is that even without all these things, can I create a mechanism where I can take the refugees in, provide humane living conditions, give them their essential human rights, including a right to work, without necessarily threatening the rest of the country? Is that possible? And that's a question that we're not necessarily asking. We're trying to find, the rotten egg among in a whole carton without the use of water. I mean, this is not going to happen. You can't tell. You can't tell.
I think to quote Stephanie Miller, that xenophobia with a Z in Columbia County, I think. Ignorance is bliss. I would argue that Christian colonial expansion throughout history seeks to pit tribes against each other. We certainly did that here. And that is certainly a tribal area that might have been just a little behind the development that we have. And its capitalist owners are the billionaire class, and we certainly wouldn't be over there if it wasn't for economic reasons. I was interested in why we didn't touch on that topic at all. But if the capitalist owner class seeks to exploit people, they will continually have us to be divided. That's historically throughout this country, from all the Eastern European nations that came over. I'd like to see if you had anything to say about that.
That's what I was trying to allude to, the second pattern of thinking. Because we approach the history of that region as if it's a history that is marked with us trying to help the primitives or the backward people, or it's a history of direct occupation of the poor, victimized people, we are missing the whole business deal that is going in between. We empowered people. There's a very important influential anthropologist called Timothy Mitchell who wrote extensively about that. In the context of Egypt, he wrote Rule of Experts. In the context of Iraq and petroleum industry, he wrote Carbon Democracy, focusing on these business deals, emphasizing that if you follow the money, and that's not my idea, obviously, but if you follow the money, if you actually figure out who's helping how, who, you can also see that there are groups in Egypt, there are groups in Iraq, there are groups in Syria who are dying to cooperate. People like Ahmed Chalabi, I was using him as an example. People like him are trying to get alliances built up here so that they can exert their influence there. And there's nothing wrong with that. Everybody needs to protect their own interests. But this has to be transparent if it is being done with our money. If we are being asked to contribute to that, we have a right to demand transparency. That is not being done. Instead, we are being encouraged to think of these people as they are oppressed, they're backward, they're primitive, they're going to welcome us with open arms. We're going to democratize those people. We're asked to buy these arguments without necessarily revealing to us that this is a complex process. Some people will make money out of this, and some people will get rich because of this, and your money will not necessarily go to help the poor or the needy or the victims in those countries, but will end up going to Kellogg or will end up going to Halliburton. Those are the deals that are not being made explicit. I agree fully with you on that.
So my perception since I relocated up here is that this local paper, and I've spoken to the editor at least 4 times, to try to get him or suggest to print something intellectually stimulating just a little bit. It's a microcosm of Fox, because we have the Ireleys that own this paper, and Rupert owns Fox. And they control the message. And I would just say, it's nice for us to think about the history of the Middle East. It would be interesting if more of us knew the history of the Heritage Foundation and what their goals were.
Well, I agree with you. I don't have cable at home. I can't have blood pressure issues.
Yeah, I don't.
I'm trying to avoid any sorts of agitation and anger. I try to follow as independent news as possible from Democracy Now! I try to get Al Jazeera and other places. And I rely on those sources. And there I find stuff that is not included in NPR. Stuff that is not included on BBC.
Well, since Tommy Thompson was in there, I guess NPR has changed quite drastically too.
So I agree with you that we can't. It's not easy to find relevant information. It is not easy to find where the money flows, particularly. But we need to, I think, we can be more alert. I mean, there are several references to Democracy Now! On this brief paper that I mentioned, and so I think it is the knowledge is out there. Obviously, I mean, I'm not living there. I'm getting that knowledge, and I'm not very good in Arabic by any means. So I'm getting that knowledge from other languages, English, Turkish, other languages, but not necessarily by me. So it is out there. It is out there.
Would you actually be a Noam Chomsky fan? Where?
I am, yes.
Okay, I thought so. But anyway, that would answer. He considered us a failed state. That old joke by who was it? Will Rogers says we got the best Congress money can buy. And so when that comes in, you got Brandeis, other people like that says you got an oligarchy. And the reason why you're following the money works is in absence of principled government, in absence of a democracy behind that money. you'll get just what you're talking about. That's why we have the parliament.
I am not just necessarily a fan of Noam Chomsky, but also I'm a fan of discussing these issues. And one thing that I observe a lot, I'm not a native to this country. I came in 1998 from Turkey. One thing that I find very strange about this country is that people don't talk politics. As much as their life is affected by that, people don't talk religion or politics. Not freely, not openly, not in public, which is odd. Well, to me, which is odd, at least. And I think, and that's why I try to make by pointing these out. I try to make my stance clear. I'm not trying to hide anything or where I stand politically. But I'm okay with being asked questions and being challenged. But I would like to see these issues more problematized, more debated, and how do we get that done by being open to different religious practices, bringing this, problematizing this, as a philosopher would have said, making this problematic, so that we can talk about this, so that we can debate the truth in this, we can negotiate the truth in this. Without that, there's no discussion, and we end up buying. Somebody wrote it down. Yes.
But to begin, throughout your presentation, before we start the question, you presented, the reasoning very historical and economical.
Mhm.
All these different reasons why things are happening. There is no mentioning religion.
Yeah.
Do you think that, and you quote that I wrote down because I really like when you said we give people the power of using religion to generate violence. We tend to blame a lot of things on religion. Whether we blame a Christian or Muslim or atheist, we tend to blame institutionally. You say religion doesn't have arm and legs, religion doesn't kill people. But if we were able to go to look beyond religion or to take religion out of the issue, do you think we will be able to see these situations more rationally?
Yes.
Like, you were saying about, Columbia County, because we cling to those things as safety, and some people, of course, education helps, and lack of it hinders, but how, and it brings back to how do we help, it probably goes farther than talking about this issue, it goes to how to restructure the education system to teach people to think for themselves. But, if we were able to just take the fact that this is not a Muslim versus Christian, or just look at the political and economical ramification. Or is not mine too much of a simplistic view? Sometimes
No. I think religion. The problem is you're asking a question whether the talk about religion has an impact on politics and real life of individuals, or is it vice versa?
What I'm saying is religion here, obviously, it is used to polarize, to pit people against, to shift the real focus from what it should be.
Yeah, it is, and
how are thousands of people not able to see this?
Power runs it. Power runs it. Power runs it. Power runs it. Whether you're talking the wealth or the religion or what. This runs the tentacles down and keeps it simple down here. They don't care. Things don't trickle down, they trickle up. And that's where the problem is.
I'm not. As much as I agree that there's a lot of power issues there, I don't necessarily ascribe to the monolith structure, a singular structure of power, or that power comes from top. I think there's a lot that's coming from bottom going up too. People buy into these roles. The example that I was using was Iraq, right? I was saying in Iraq you see being associated with being a Shia or a Sunni Muslim will get you to places. Okay, I'll do that. Then I'll become more associated. It came to a point after the U.S. invasion of Iraq that people were stopping others in checkpoints, and they're descriptively Shia names. Ali, Hussein, for example. Those are Shia names, okay? So they're asking your name. And if you say Ali, you have to guess whether that guy is a Sunni Muslim or not. You can get shot at the point because there's no control mechanism. So at that point, you are physically being forced to step into a religious identity. Now, how do we see the politics or economics behind this? Well, if you look at the urban, the structure of the city, if you look at how if we can change that, shift that, where the secure points are, if those companies that are building safe zones, who gets those safe zones? Who gets housing in those safe zones? Do we leave them to the sort of privacy of one particular group, or can everybody get access to that easily? Those are the political economic means that could render religious differences irrelevant. So I'm not saying that we can take religion out from everybody.
No.
But we can make religious differences irrelevant from the economic consequences, from political consequences. As long as we are not able to do that, and that's not only here. I mean, do you think we will ever elect a Muslim president? So anywhere. So unless we can separate the access to power or authority from religious affiliation, not only top, but also, I will use that. If it is a life and death choice, if it's a choice between protecting my family, and I will say, I'll be whatever you want me to be. I'll be, whatever group you want me to be. Because I'm put into that position.
Speaking of general power and economics as a overarching issue within this, I've often heard in very low coverage situations of private individuals within Saudi Arabia as a major situation that led to Al-Qaeda having funding and ISIS even having funding now. But I don't hear much of Saudi Arabia being pressured to crack down upon this, and nor do I hear them cracking down upon it either. And that just is very clearly a political economic issue, so as to maintain the value of the petrodollar itself.
Saudi Arabia just recently signed the largest contract it ever did with the United States on one of these deals. And we're not going to do anything. We're not going to do the best. We tried to, in the past, we sent sort of emissaries of good faith saying that we're going to win the hearts and minds of people. Those people went and said, one day Saudi women will gain the right to drive, and made a fool of themselves back in 2004, in 2006. We have failed at that over and over. So we turn the other way when Saudis do certain things like that. And most importantly, because Saudis are an essential force for us, not just Saudis. Bahrain is another country in the Gulf that we have massive investments in. Companies in Texas or Oklahoma are building military bases there. It's generating jobs for us, and there's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, we're supporting regimes that openly, explicitly imprison Shia Muslims. Lately, since 2004 summer, Saudi Arabia has been killing in thousands of people in Yemen by drone attacks. And those people they're killed at random. I mean, there are several pieces on that. I mean, if you look at drone attacks in Yemen, if you just simply Google it, you'll see that when you kill someone, you leave an artifact. You leave those bombshells on the ground. And it has our name. They're made in Wisconsin. They're made in some parts of this country. Then you'll go try to explain that to the families who end up seeing their loved ones die right in front of them. That is not an easy explanation, and we don't even bother. Perhaps that's why. We give death money per person. In Iraq, it used to be around $5,000 or $6,000. I'm not certain what it is right now. If somebody's killed innocently, but there's no guarantee what's going to happen to those people when they grow up, or if their parents are dead, or if their family member. What's going to happen in a few years? So we're dealing with creating scenarios where we have unintended consequences, and that's going to generate more violence. Saudi Arabia is the perfect example. They've been afraid of losing their power against Iran, the Shia power in the region, and they've been worried about their Shia minority. They've been worried about other Shia minority states, countries in that region, and they've been oppressing people. left and right. Just recently they gave the woman right to vote, and you know, there's nothing to be proud about Saudi Arabia or our relationship with Saudi Arabia. We're not questioning that, and that's one thing that we could do perhaps, you know, ask, why are we not questioning a country that is so openly, so explicitly against human rights values? We're talking about punishment of people being, you know, crucified, upside down. I mean, what justifies that?
By the way, something what people have been asking what to do. I've been involved in a public statement initiative with the LGBTQ community, and what everybody can do actually is to articulate just what you just said, the unintentional consequences. All the way from simple things like when you join a Boy Scout, you know, what are the unintentional consequences? You leave all gays out, and you want to promote that as a church. Has anybody not been able to come out in the church and say, this is who I am? What are the consequences of having denied your identity for so many years? And some people have committed suicide and say, yeah, I can't tell a story. You really better believe at all levels, if it can be done in churches, if it can be done, what is the potential of saying that if you're godless, you're not good, we won't even vote for you? Do you leave a lot of people out? Or if you do that with Muslims, what happens to their lives when they're surrounded by hate? Have we ever talked to a Muslim and said, this is the consequence of what happens when we hate you? And so I don't think people feel the pain. I really don't think people, and you don't have to be right there with them. You can just use your imagination, like you're writing a book and say, okay, I want to do an interview. I don't see why all of us could do that if that's promoted at churches and whatever.
I'm not certain how much we can understand or sympathize with that kind of abuse unless we are actually exposed to it ourselves. I don't think we can understand what a person who's discriminated against goes through unless we are actually discriminated against. I mean, that's my perspective at least. And this is not just a Muslim issue. I mean, I don't think we can understand racism towards African Americans in this country unless we are. And I'm not saying that we should not try to, but we have to. My point of view is that I think we need to understand that they're facing something that perhaps is very difficult for us to understand in our white spaces, in our protected spaces, in our privileged position.
Well, I agree with you that that's the ultimate, because we can't be in the personhood. I'm talking about an imagination. Like if you read a novel, if you read a good novel, it takes you into it. But if you read it flat and say, oh, when can I turn this in for a turntable? I mean, where do we have moral imagination? Where we have the reading? You can do this by reading or by imagining. But you have to feel somebody else's pain. That's the moral disposition you have to come in with.
I hate to take up time, but I think it's that fourth estate that we're really missing here. Because what people need is information. This is, my assumption, is a relatively informed group. And that's why we're here. But if, like when you were just speaking, this young man brought up Saudi Arabia. Like those of us who are familiar with it understand the human rights travesty that the House of Saud regime perpetuates. But we don't have any moral authority even to discuss that truly, because if you take a look at our own prison population and the disparity that we have in our own prisons, and Americans aren't really aware of that, and I would submit that it's because we're down to like 5 large corporations that control the media and they control the message. And if we had that information, we might be able to make some informed decisions, you know?
The Nation wrote extensively about prison abuse, and since last year they've been writing extensively on for-profit prisons and the abuse that abuses it takes place. And I agree with that. I don't think these issues are separated, and I think it's an essential human rights issue, perhaps. That's how we should fight it, but there is an urgency at the moment.
So I'm curious as to your students that come. Do you feel they're totally unprepared to discuss these matters with you? Do you find that they come with open minds? And I'd love for you to just respond.
I had 2 of my best students in class here, even though I did not even mention that this was going on. And it varies from year to year. There's a lot of lack of awareness of certain issues, and I contribute to that. I confuse them a lot. When I talk about a lot of the details of Islamic history and on different levels, And, but I among those who take part in the class, who come into class, I always see a very positive impact, and I just see a deep interest in the larger questions. And you know me, I'm very scattered, and I can't stay focused. That's why I have to write things down. And I try to stay focused, and I just jump from here to there. I talk about racism, I talk about Saudi Arabia, I talk about this, I talk about that, and at the end, they kind of got accustomed to that. Okay, there he goes again, and it's just weird. And then we engage in a dialogue. We talk about stuff, and I see some interest. But then again, it's not as much as you would have. It's not as much as the interest that I would have in an American history class. And it's not an issue of students. To me, it is a wealth issue because many of my students have to work. Couple jobs, full time, and you know that it's very difficult. It is very difficult to actually work full time and to maintain good high-level academic interest on topics such as this, because we're not generating a body of students who are dying to read and dying to learn more.
A question about the concept of separation of church and state as it's understood here, although it's become more blurred, I believe, as opposed to in the Middle East. Could you speak to that? Is that something that's generally appreciated over there?
Separation of religion and state, if what we're talking about is the French understanding of secularity, because I don't think we have separation of religion and state in this country. But if what we're talking,
we give lip service to it.
but
Some
if we're talking about the French and the way that it is perceived in the Middle East, it's a part of an intellectual package that is associated with one, colonial regime. The French have been there throughout the 19th century. Two, it's been associated with the dictatorial regimes that have been put in place. Assad's regime was a secular regime. Saddam Hussein's regime was a secular regime. The Egyptian government, one after not all the Egyptian dictators were secular dictators. As a matter of fact, they killed the Salafist members among them, or they imprisoned them. The Egyptian government did back in the 1950s. So the association with secularist regimes in the 1950s and 60s are not that bright either. And the only religious groups are the groups that are like Iran or Saudi Arabia, that are trying to infiltrate into places like Lebanon or Jordan and other places by sending their missionaries, building schools and stuff. So they're creating a tension between what is known as the legacy of secular dictatorial regimes versus the source of money and religious affiliation. In my understanding, and that's not me thinking, there's a guy called Tal Assad, who teaches at the City University, an anthropologist. He writes extensively about secularization and secular states. The notion of secular, what we know as secular nations, is based on the separation of certain themes, certain elements. It's not necessary. It's based on public and private, separation of public and private. In that sense, that could be valid anywhere that you go. You can talk about secularism in the Middle Eastern countries. You should be able to. But we can't. Why? Because we're dealing with a particular regimes or a particular history that pushed religious groups to the side. The Egyptian government, the government that has the largest subsidy program in the region, subsidy program that allows people to buy sugar, let's say, a pound of sugar, for the quarter of a price that unsubsidized buyers can get. So there's a lot of poverty there. The Egyptian government have been using Muslim Brotherhood as a token, as a monster under the bed, saying that, look, I have Muslim Brotherhood, you gotta give me money so that I can keep them under control. We know that the government had been supporting Muslim Brotherhood throughout that time period. And when the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, the army, Egyptian army, which owns hotels, water companies. They sell bottled water and they own car factories in that country. They just ousted the Muslim Brotherhood government, which was democratically elected. We see the same process playing out in Palestine, in Gaza. Hamas was ousted, despite the fact that it was democratically elected to that power. So at this point, we're not dealing with an objective notion of secularism here. We're dealing with groups that have been cast aside, oppressed, pushed aside deliberately by governments that get their support power from international forces or global economy in one form or another, and they've been outcasting these groups. It has turned into revenge politics game. So, in that sense, no, we can't talk about secularism. So yes and no. I can't, there's no single answer there. Send the link to this to you,
Definitely.
and maybe we can put it on,
We'll put it on
your
the website.
Would that be okay? So
Absolutely.
that way we will avoid the hassle of me collecting your emails, and you can download it anytime.
Yes.
I promise to get to this as soon as I'm done with grading by this weekend hopefully, and then I'll send it to you. Which one? Upper level, I'm still deciding. Lower level, we're stuck with egg. I'm still deciding on some of the numbers. Sorry. I will definitely email you once I know what they're. I'll definitely email you. Just give me some time if it's something you're good grade. Thank you.
Okay, I've only had.
Yeah.